Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I started with this symbolic act. So there was a head on the table in front of all of you, and inside the head, when I opened it, maybe you didn't pay attention, but I opened the skull, and inside the skull there was an apple. Surprise, surprise. Rather than a brain. Then I took the apple out of the head, and I left the brain. This is symbolically my starting point to present a view that may appear very controversial to you. As Alex said, we went from, let's say, a more standard view of perception to an increasingly less plausible or more adventurous hypothesis about the nature of consciousness. And this is the hypothesis that I would like to present with you today, which is the mind-object identity, which is the idea that maybe the reason why it has been so difficult for us to explain consciousness is that we started from the wrong foot, is that we started from an assumption that may appear obvious to every one of us, namely that we are different from the object we experience, namely that we have a relation with the object that we experience, and therefore we needed to introduce and to explain a lot of metaphysically very difficult notions, such as seeing, such as perceiving, such as having phenomenal conscious acquaintance, or maybe representing the world, while the truth might have been from the start that we were not a subject perceiving a world. We had always been a world impinging on the bodies of on the subject's body. So what I'm trying to do with this hypothesis, which is, I'm a philosopher, but this is an empirical hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that maybe we were wrong about the piece of the physical world we believe to be. So we always try to find ourselves in the brain or in the body. And we had a body-centric view of our life. But maybe we were wrong. Maybe we have to shift from a body-centric view of our existence to an object-centric view of our existing. I understand that the first time that you hear this notion, it appears totally implausible. But let's try to see whether it is really the case that this view cannot be defended. So many years ago, almost 10 years ago, I was speaking with Alex in his office, and I claimed that from a sentence like that, and I do agree with Nicholas Humphrey that there's a lot of mystery in this sentence, that in a claim like that, basically the only thing that we really understand is not the eye, pace Descartes, it's not the seeing, which is required only if we assume that the eye is different from the apple. The only thing here that we're sure about is the apple. The apple is the only physical entity in this sentence. Seeing is not a physical verb, because we don't know, to consciously see, of course, I'm not talking about just recognition, but seeing requires a subject who sees, and the I, the self, is even more mysterious. So the only thing we're sure about here, contrary a lot of empiricist tradition in philosophy, is the apple. And if you look inside the brain, I mean, there are a lot of very interesting phenomena, and the commonsensical view is that there is something inside. And look at how easily the notion of an inner view of the mind became the inside of the head. But the fact is that nobody so far has found anything like our conscious experience in the brain. There's always one last step to be done. There's always one last gap to be bridged. And that gap, it doesn't matter how small we make it, it is always there. And so what can we do? And this is a knowledge by Anil, for example, in his paper, and by basically every scientist. And my point is that this is not a surprise to me, because we are asking to the brain to do something which is impossible, What do we ask to the brain, which is an object in the world? Look at that brain on the table. We're asking to that brain to have something of another object, which is the apple. I use the apple as the paradigmatic example. I keep to the standard object for philosophers. So, so basically we are asking to the brain to be a brain and yet not to be a brain, to be something else. The notion of appearance or experience is basically a self-contradictory notion, metaphysically and ontologically speaking. It's something that exists and does not exist, to be or not to be. That is something impossible, so the brain, doesn't matter how complex it is, it will never be able to be an apple. So my point is that, thank you very much neuroscience, because so far you have repeatedly demonstrated that consciousness is not a phenomenon in the brain. We don't know what it is, but we need to find ourselves in the physical world. Let me also say that, as it is usually stated, the hard problem is a little bit like the philosopher's stone, because we require an object, which is the brain, and I stress this, the fact that the brain, after all, is just an object in the physical world, a very complex object, and I understand that for our narcissism, it's very nice to say, yes, but the brain will do something that nothing else does in the universe. But my point is that no matter how complex the brain will always belong to the category of physical objects. And physical objects, what do? They are what they are. They have their own properties. They have exactly those properties that we can see, that we can measure, that we can observe. And that's the nature of physical objects, to be what they are. So it seems to me that right now we are repeatedly looking for something that the brain cannot simply do. And this is the hallmark of what in science is a pseudo-problem. It seems intractable. It does not stem from empirical observation, but likely from some wrong premise. For example, let me make you an example in a different domain. Take dark matter. Dark matter is a problem for astronomers, but it is a problem that resulted out of their observation. But if you ask to a neuroscientist, when you study a brain, if you didn't know that that brain is associated with consciousness, do you observe anything taking place that would suggest the existence of consciousness inside of the brain, or you're looking for consciousness only because you know that the brain is conscious because someone told you about it? And the fact is that no neuroscientist has ever found any neuron moving faster or slower than it should, based on what they observe. That's different from dark matter, because in that case, people have been observing the stars of galaxies, and they show that they're actually spinning faster than they should. And another property of pseudo-problem is that usually they're not solved. We haven't found epicycles. We haven't measured epicycles more precisely or found how they move. We simply understood that that was just not a problem. It got dissolved. And once again, let me quote Galileo, one of the main reasons for the poverty of science, in the Bertolt Brecht's version, of course, that it is supposed to be so rich, that it pretends to know more than it actually does. So let me try to be bold. Let me try to be brave, and I will follow the suggestion of these three guys. One is Sherlock Holmes, which is, as you know, a thriller version of Aristotle. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. And Einstein, let's make one step backward. And Galileo, let's not be afraid of going against common sense. And we need, in the suggestion of Stu, I suggest a revolution. But we need to be bold, otherwise why are we here? So my point is, let's consider a standard case of perception. So we will get to hallucination too, very soon. But let's start from the simplest case. We perceive an apple, and we happen to have an apple in front of us. No illusion, no hallucination. I'm a physicalist. In such a case, we have two objects. We have a body with a brain, a wonderfully complex object. And then we have an object, the apple. If I ask it to this guy, what do you find right now in your existence? He would say, I found a red apple. I find a red apple. There's a red apple in my existence right now. Okay, there are two objects, once again, the body and the apple. Which of them is closer, is more similar to the experience that that human being, that person at this time has? The brain or the apple? Which one of them is closer to the experience? And I would rather say the existence. I'm not making an English mistake right now. I'm shifting from the word experience to the word existence. Because I don't know whether using the word existence is the right move to do. Because once I use the word experience, I'm already a dualist. I'm already assuming that experience is something different from reality. And why did I invent the notion of experience, historically, not myself, but why did I introduce this notion? Because I assumed that I was not the world. And therefore, if I am not the world and I find the world in my existence, I need to invent the notion of experience as a way for the world to reach me after I had assumed I am not the world. But you know that if we believe in physicalism, we have to be identical with something physical. And here we have two options. Am I the body or am I the object? Which one is closer to us? My hypothesis is to make such a shift, which is not to say that that the brain and the body are no longer important. As we will see, they are key to understand the nature of the object we have in front of us. But it suggests that we can get rid of the metaphysical problem of consciousness by shifting our reference frame from a body-centric view of ourselves to an object-centric view of ourselves. And so, rather than suggesting a mind-brain identity, I am suggesting a mind-object identity. And I see absolutely no reason why I should find more commonsensical to be identical to a neural process than to be identical to an apple. Because both are physical. Both are physical objects. So the idea is to shift from experience to existence. Once you do that, you have a series of dramatic advantages. First of all, you can reduce experience to existence. You no longer need the notion of aboutness, that is an arrow between the subject and the object, because you have identity with the object itself. That's why you find the properties of the object in your experience, in your existence. The yellow of the banana, the red of these chairs, and so forth, because you are those objects. And the idea is that you can get rid of notions such as the remembered present, because it becomes the other way around. It is the past that is perceived past. And then we will get to the issue of hallucination and the like. But once again, rather than thinking that all the time we are a brain that hallucinates veridically the world, we are just a world that it is what it is, and we can explain hallucinations in terms of perception, the other way around. So I just try to make it as conspicuous as possible that we might be the objects that are taking place thanks to our brain. And look at what it happens. We can reduce the obnoxious expression, I see an apple, that is metaphysically so problematic, to another sentence. An apple exists relatively to a body. In the second sentence, there is no longer any metaphysically troublesome expression. Seeing is reduced to a matter of identity with an object that takes place relative to a visual system. We no longer need the arrow of intentionality. And we got rid also of the very problematic notion of the eye. And everything here is physical. An apple is physical. The body is physical. So just to make it clear, rather than looking for a mind-body or mind-brain identity, we look for mind-object identity. And therefore, things such as a brain in a vat would no longer be possible. But we have no empirical proof of them. So I'm not going to argue against hypotheses that are considered to be plausible only because we start from the idea that there's a separation between us and the world. Very quickly, there are two objections that will immediately come to your attention. The first one is subjective variability. How is this theory coping with the fact that we all perceive reality in a different way? Haven't we invented subjectivity to cope with the fact that I see many colors? Maybe someone of us is colorblind, maybe someone of us sees the banana different shade of yellow or whatever. How can we cope with the variability of our experience / existence if we are identical with the world? Well, I don't need to go very far, because we know from physics that many properties are relative. So if I asked you, is this apple right now moving? What is the velocity of this apple? You may tell me it is still. And I would say, yes, it is still relative to our bodies right now in this room, but it is moving at the relative speed to the moon of 10,000 miles per hour, which is an impressive, right now, this apple is moving in all directions. Or consider another property. For example, the white of the screen. If you get closer to the screen, you would see that the white is in reality a grid of red, green, and blue dots. And at the same time, this screen is both, well, it should have been white. It's both white and a grid of red, green, and light. Which one is the true color of the screen? It is white relative to you, to your bodies. It is red, green, and blue relative to someone with a body closer. It is both at the same time. And the same is true. Well, here a slide is missing. The same is true for sounds. Yesterday here I spoke with a presentation with a postdoc that made a very interesting job, Melia Bonomo, about the fact that different ears bring into existence different sounds. That's why that's because the sound is relative to the kind of ear that is able to get it. And at the same time, these objects are objects in time because they take place, like the fridge light. And of course, they are there. Such properties are there whenever we need them. So how can this theory cope with the subjective variability, rather than having many subjective versions of one object in the world, we have in the world as many objects as bodies, because each body is different. Actually, we have as many objects as other objects. And then finally we get to the point of hallucinations. Hallucination seems to be a death blow to such a theory, because in hallucination, don't we dream of an apple when there are no apple around? Don't we dream of totally fantastic objects? And here the reply comes once again from physics, and this is not by chance, because this is a theory that tries to reduce the mind to physical objects, and therefore we must find all the solutions in physics. And I'm a bit ashamed. Standard physics is enough. So I don't need to resort to very esoteric physical phenomena, because standard physics, as I said, relative velocity is something that we have all studied at school. Now, what do I mean? I mean that in physics we know that every phenomenon takes place with a time span and a spatial span that is greater than 0. So this paves the way to consider physical phenomenon as something that is extended in time. This is consistent with another very interesting fact, namely that if we look at the hallucination, we, from an empirical perspective, starting from René Descartes, we find out that they are made of pieces of our everyday life. We don't dream of a color we've never seen. We don't dream of a taste of some food that we've never tried, that we've never eaten. And so we may say that as far as we know, hallucinations are a composite experience of moments of previous reality. Something more similar to a catfish like that than something else. So the idea is that once we consider that the time span is greater than 0, there's no magic threshold that allows us to consider only objects that are, say, 100 milliseconds from the effect in the brain, as it happens in standard perception. But we can consider arbitrarily long time spans in such a way that as long as such objects are still having a causal effect with what's going on in the brain, as it happens, for example, in memory or in dreams, as when we dream of a composition of events that in the past had been part of our life. And so, for example, if we start with an apple, we will find out plenty of examples, also in standard perception, that show that we can extend our experience. So, last night from the rooftop, we saw a beautiful moon, but the moon was 1 second and a half in the past. And today, here we had the sun in Taormina, and the sun was at 8 minutes. But is there any difference between these objects, or they are all inside our present? And my answer is that they're all inside our present. Even the stars that we see in a starry night that may be at hundreds of years, tens of years, they are still part of our present. That's because from physics we learn that the present is not made of synchronous event, that was the old Newtonian notion, but the present is made by simultaneous events, namely events that are right now producing an effect in our body or in our measurement instrument. So rather than having, let's say, this is the Newtonian idea of the present and the commonsensical notion of the present, of synchronous event, we must consider something like that, which is the simultaneous notion of the present, which comes from physics, which comes from, as of Einstein, we should get rid of the first notion of the present, which is a leftover of Newtonian absolute space-time, and we should embrace the idea that the present is made by the simultaneous objects, which is no longer the present of the body, it is the present of the object. Once again, this is let's say, consequence of shifting from the notion of a body-centric to a notion of object-centric view. So, hallucination may be redefined in terms of postponed and reshuffled perception. So it's no longer perception that is explained in terms of hallucination. It is the other way around. And so we have plenty of examples that may show us, this is from a Swiss artist, that we can compose many phantasmagorical entities out of everyday objects. So, the mind-object identity is a strong physicalist theory, which tries to reduce the problem of consciousness to identity. And it tries to bridge the gap between the subject and the object by making the apparently preposterous hypothesis that such a gap had only been assumed, but that we are one with the object. So the proposal is that the difficult sentence we started from, that the subject experiences the objects, might simply be that the object exists relative to the body of the subject, to the body. And what is the subject in the second sentence? It's O. The object is the subject. So you see, I tried here to represent an object-centric view of reality. You see that those human being silhouettes have no head, and what they thought was inside their head, as in Escher's painting, it is just made by the world of objects, each of them taking place relative to the body of these people. So, to summarize, we may make a very coarse comparisons between, let's say, a school version of these views. In dualism, the subject, which is not physical, perceives the object. Here we have two mysteries. What is the subject, and what is the relation between something that is not physical with something that is physical? The perceiving, the perception. Then neuroscience came and suggested to put the brain in the place of the subject. But still we have a mystery, perception. And sometimes they say, as in the beautiful quote by Anais Nin, that we don't perceive the things as they are. We see things as we are. But still we have a mystery. What is the we? I don't know. Oh, well, I don't know in the field of neuroscience. And I suggest that the we is the object. So, perceiving is being something. What something? Which something? The thing we assumed we perceived. So there's no longer that problem. So, once again, moving from Descartes to, just to summarize, in Descartes there was the idea that the consciousness is not material and that consciousness is not in the body. Then, in the classic neuroscience, they slightly modified this view. They said, no, we are physicalists, we are against dualism. Consciousness must be a process function. Here it is a little bit imprecise, but take it. But that the consciousness has to be either in the body or some emergent property out of the body. And of course, consciousness cannot be the object. The mind-object identity suggests to slightly modify this picture, and it suggests that consciousness is totally material. It is an object, taking place relative to a body. But consciousness is not the body, it is the object. So the idea is, rather than being inside the brain, prisoner in a dark pitch prison in the head, we are made of the world. And the world is what we are identical with. And what is the role of the body? The role of the body is to allow a world, a physical world, to impinge against our body and to produce effect. If our bodies were not here, such a world, as it happens relative to my body, would not exist. So, to end, I just draw as a conclusion that that's my proposal of the mind-object identity, to shift from the subject to the object, to set aside our narcissistic view that we are separate from and different from the world of physical objects, and to embrace our nature of physical entities. Thank you.